As you all know, I have made it a mission to reconstruct Roman and Byzantine archery. But because there is a lack of technical description despite the number of sources that reference said technical approach, then I have to approach it from all angles. This includes looking to the outside for input, and one of those is a German soldier from the early 17th century by the name of Johann Jacobi von Wallhausen. More than just a soldier, he was a military advisor to the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands, and more importantly, a military author. His career consisted of publishing a compendium of works that were pictographic in nature, and with the increasing standards of art quality in the Renaissance, features technically fleshed out and realistic portrayals of military equipment, engineering, and battle formations of contemporary Protestant militaries. Among his works was a peculiar one, which was an adaptation of the late Roman writer Vegetius's work De Re Militari, to which Wallhausen dubbed the Romanesque Art of War. The extent of this secondary source illustrated the sections of Vegetius's essay on the training and drilling of the individual soldier. Much like everyone else in the Renaissance, the figures portrayed are clad in Roman-like attire, but with a clear idealization of their aesthetic, which lacks historical accuracy. This is the common trend in the Renaissance in most works, and Vegetius's essay were a particularly influential set on those in the 16th and 17th centuries. Included in these illustrations are details of historically inaccurate weapons to the Romans, but were probably more accurate to the contemporary. This leads me to believe that the idealized attire of the soldiers were meant to portray the Roman roots of the training methods, but by giving them obviously contemporary German weapons like messers and wicker shields and, in my interest, straight bows, it was meant to be a sort of attempt at recontextualizing them for a potential modern use. After all, this was a sort of period in which historical medieval weapons were at a crossover with modernized gunpowder-based warfare. The point I'm making is that while it is true that there are obvious inaccuracies, it is done with the intention on being as authentic in their portrayals as possible, for it to retain their relevance to its time. Regardless, the author of the work, and by extension the illustrators, were people who were learned in both De Re Militari and contemporary warfare, just based on their credentials. It's a bit of a stretch to say that von Wallhausen was just a guy who knew nothing about fighting techniques, and so he had illustrated portrayals entirely made up of artistic license that's inaccurate. I think at that point anyone who would say that is just being needlessly paranoid over the stigma of illustrated sources being unreliable. Whatever artistic license is taken is obvious, and even then it comes from a background of reliable knowledge and experience, given that von Wallhausen was himself a soldier and military advisor, in a time when archery was still being used to some extent. So as far as archery is concerned, even if we can't say it's entirely accurate to the Romans, it comes from the mindset of a soldier in his time, and can be pretty telling of his awareness of a technical approach to archery that, while in decline, was still very much alive, at least theoretically so. The one page of the manuscript in question depicts figures shooting what looks to be straight bows, possibly long bows, which was typical in a later European context, though there was more than one design of bow in Europe. Each figure seems to be in a different stage of shooting the bow, and from top to bottom seems to be done in chronological order from pulling the arrow out of the quiver all the way to the release and follow through. Starting with figure number 6, there's nothing too special to note here other than the kind of bow that it is of a straight bow, and possibly a long bow, which is something characteristic of medieval archery at the time, but not exclusive of other kinds of bows. Another thing to note is that the legs are crossed over in this case as the archer reaches for an arrow in his side quiver. Based on the hand positioning, it seems that he is initially grabbing the arrow with the palm up, implying that he's grabbing immediately with his index and middle finger. The possible reason for this is a more fluid shift between nocking and placing the fingers on the string. Figure number 7 is where things start to get interesting. The archer stands, likely with the feet completely in a straight line with the target, but also seems to be jutting out his hip, indicating that he's leaning slightly back. Another thing, he has the arrow knocked to the outside of the bow, and especially so, it seems they are using a finger draw, possibly the top 2 fingers. This has been a point of controversy among medieval archery enthusiasts, some believing that it's too impractical to use finger draws on the outside of the bow, and some even add the fact of generally poorer aerodynamics when releasing on this side. Despite the fact that constant experimentation has shown that finger draws can easily be done on the outside of the bow, and there already exist techniques all over Asia for improving aerodynamics in their shooting, still there are people who think that shooting on the outside of the bow in a European context is wrong because reasons. And there are only right and wrong ways of doing things if you are European. I'm sure those people also believe that Europe and Asia are divided by an invisible wall that impedes people, technology, and ideas from physically crossing over, as if they are playing Halo 4's campaign. While a bit more on the conjecturous side, I believe that the chronology with these next two figures and how they connect to this one tells a lot about Wallhausen's depiction of functional archery. From the looks here, figure 8 is still using their arrow on the outside, is still leaning on their front leg, and even leaning back. As a kinesiologist, just doing this without the tension of the bow already allows for a squeeze of the entire latissimus dorsi and rhomboids. By arching the back like this, it allows for those larger muscles to shorten and engage into the draw more. Next, as is typical with finger draws, it seems that the archer's draws are rather short, to the corner of the mouth or maybe just past it. Figure 10, the archer with the shield, however, is depicted drawing back to the ear, which is the manner that Procopius described. And it even seems that the string is by the forehead, as similar to his description as well. So it would seem that, according to Wallhausen's depiction, there wasn't one standard draw length, but it also varied. Between figure 8 and figure 9, there is evidence of how the release was performed. Upon release, we can assume that the scapulae are brought together, keeping the release as expanding as possible. The shoulder and the elbow are, vertically, kept at the same straight level, but it is the line between the elbow and hand that swings back like a trapdoor. What's interesting is that usually when releases are done, the hand is brought back completely in a straight line at the same level as the shoulder or even lower. But here the arm is still slightly bent and the hand is well above the head. The palm faces upward with the thumb and fingers opening away from each other. But more importantly is the positioning of the bow. One could say that it's the archer just relaxing the bow hand after the shot, but if that were true, he wouldn't keep posing with his string hand. He would have relaxed both hands. You know how I said that all over Asia there exists techniques that improved aerodynamics on the right of the bow? Well, call this conjecture, but I believe we may have just come across substantial evidence for a European form of hatra done on with a larger bow. In hatra, the bow and the bow hand must move itself out of the way so that neither the shaft nor the hand interfere with the flight of the arrow, thus stabilizing it. A common problem with those who have experimented with longbows that while shooting on the right is that the sheer length of the bow itself makes it rather unwieldy to commit such a sharp act from the wrist. This problem seems to be answered by evidence of the relaxing of the shoulder and from the bow pointing down, as though it traveled in a quarter circle. Maybe this is the archer simply relaxing the bow hand after hitting their target, as I've said before, or this is the result of a practical action to stabilize arrow flight, either or. The angle of the wrist after the release contrasts with the straight line of the wrist with the drawn bow before it, implying, if it were so simple, that there is still movement in the wrist in application of some torque to the bow. But the addition of the shoulder adduction supports the overall mechanics of moving a large bow out of line with the arrow. Additionally, there could also be a slight counterclockwise motion which could justify the reason that the bottom limb ends up in front of the knee. Though what we know for sure is that for the limb to end off in front of the knee, then the bow itself is kept as vertical as possible, as a clockwise cant of the bow could make this difficult. So I'm not going to accurately portray the stance that is. I just want to show sort of the mechanics of the European hatra, I guess you can say. Or at least that's what I think. Of course, it's more conjecture, but if we're to trust that Wallhausen is a military advisor and is a soldier, and he knows a thing or two about archery, then there's some sort of accuracy or authenticity to it. The idea is that if it's not as wieldy in just this hand, then adding very like a 50-50 movement between the wrist, so you're not moving the wrist as much, but also the shoulder. The shoulder is actually where most of the hatra would come from. If I was to actually portray this right here, kind of draw it to the corner of the mouth, this motion and this, so it's kind of like bringing it down like this. In fact, you don't even need to exaggerate the torque at all. In fact, you only need to do just a little bit because most of that movement comes from dipping it down. So if you had that arrow like right here, all right, and that was loosed, it's going forth, all right, that's generally what happens to it. So before the back of the arrow can reach the bow, you've already dropped about this much. And so the idea here is that it goes with the bottom limb right to my knee. It doesn't hit my knee, but because it's turned out, if I didn't actually torque it slightly, then it would more often just actually hit my knee. But because the idea is that it's going to just to the inside of my knee, therefore it's perfectly out of the way. So it's all very economic. There's that. That one not too good. I keep thinking more of doing something along these lines, and I really should just be doing this. It's number 5. So from walking out in a straight line, you can see some of these, like this one, a bit more angled. Well, this one, then again, my camera's at an angle as well. There we go. So, straight line. This one's a little bit more at an angle, but for the most part, they're penetrating perfectly straight. Again, I think a lot of things, like, I don't think the actual, penetration angle is all too great of a factor, because a lot of things could affect this, like how the target itself is set up, and so the geometry of the impact, is it impacting on a surface, or whether or not a certain area is thicker than others. It's very hard to see, but the arrows were flying straight, straighter than normal, and straight enough for it to be good penetration. Now, it is only drawing to the corner of the mouth, so that could also be a factor, that not a lot of power is put into the arrow, so it also kind of affects the velocity, so it kind of makes performing the hydra a little easier. Excuse me, for safety reasons, I gotta get my dog out of the way.